Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back, and this is part two of a program we started last week. We have so much to say about Prudence Crandall, the pioneering woman during the 1830s who started a school for girls and then had the school for Black girls. Fascinating. We have two wonderful guests who will help us continue that story and tell you how it ends and how it continues in our country in so many ways. We have Jennifer Reisenga, who is a professor at San Jose in California, a scholar on Prudence Crandall, who I think would love to write a book about her and is probably in the process. And Joni DiMartino, who is the director of the Prudence Crandall Museum in Canterbury, Connecticut, the actual building house where Prudence Crandall established her school. So last week we had a wonderful discussion where we started out with the story, and we only got so far. We're about at the point where school is opening for the Black girls. And so I want each of our guests to give us a little history leading up to the moment where we begin again for part two. So Jennifer, why don't you tell us a little bit about the background of Prudence and how she gets to the point where we're going to start talking again.
Sure, be happy. Thanks for having us back to do part two. Prudence Crandall was a white woman, born in Rhode Island, but raised in Canterbury. She was raised Quaker, which gave her some educational advantages. And she opened a select academy for students in Canterbury in 1831. And in 1832, influenced by William Lloyd Garrison's radical newspaper, The Liberator, which was brought to her by her household helper, Mariah Davis, who was an African-American woman from Boston, Prudence Crandall was open to admitting a Black student, Sarah Harris. Sarah Harris asked if she could attend the school in order to become a teacher herself and help African-American students in the future. Crandall realized that this would cost her some in terms of how her white students might respond, but she went ahead and admitted Sarah Harris, and then they became lifelong friends. It soon became apparent, though, that the white parents and the white powers that be in Canterbury were not going to accept this idea of interracial education. So Crandall went back to the drawing board and decided to reopen her school for Black women and girls only. She sought out the aid of that radical editor, William Lloyd Garrison, went to Boston, got his assistance, and then did a grand tour of the Northeast, including Providence, New York, and New Haven, where she met with African-American leaders and white leaders in order to prepare to reopen her school in April of 1833, now for the reception of young ladies and little misses of color. And I think that will take us to where we were headed in the story.
I think it will. Only you put it so blandly, though, that she was rethinking. You called it rethinking whether or not she could open a school for Blacks and not just have white girls. But it was more than that. She got a violent reaction from the white community, didn't she, when she tried to integrate her school, right?
Yes, she did. Parents and village leaders came to her house and tried to reason with her. And then when they couldn't reason with her, got angry with her. And once she had announced the plan to open the school for Black women only, there were angry town meetings held at which Crandall was not allowed to speak because she was a woman. She wasn't even allowed to attend. However, she did send allies, and they were also shut out from the rostrum, not allowed to speak. They had to address people outside of the meeting place. The meeting place was right across the street from the school at the Congregational Church. And so a lot of the kinds of things that Joni DiMartino looks at as the curator of the museum have to do with its centrality right there in Canterbury. So this was a controversy that was not quiet. It was involving the entire reputation of the village of Canterbury.
Okay, great. So now, Joni, let's hear your summary of what we talked about last week. about the museum in the history of this.
The museum, and thank you again, Sheila, also for having us today. We're glad to be back. The museum is the most important artifact we have. As I mentioned in our previous program, we don't have a lot of artifacts from Prudence or the students, of course, because the building was attacked twice. Once it was set on fire, another time it was attacked by a mob, which we'll get to later. But I always like to really emphasize that the building itself is original and it is our most important artifact. And as we get toward the end of the story, it includes the state purchasing the building as a museum in 1969 and then turning it into a museum. They go through a renovation process because it had been a residence since 1834 when Prudence sold it. So of course it had, people stylized wallpaper and paint and added fixtures. So the renovations included trying to get it as close to 1833, 1834 as we possibly could. And now we are going through a second renovation. And this is going to be the second major renovation since the state purchased the property, which we are hoping to start in August. But the visitors, Sheila, when they attend, they love to know that they are walking, in the exact place where Sarah Harris and Prudence Crandall were, that they're in the rooms where these dialogues took place about Black education and, reading The Liberator together and discussing these articles and planning court strategies and how they're going to respond to the neighbors and who else might be interested in attending the school that they can reach out to for their support. So our building is really where it's at.
Okay, excellent. Okay, here we go. We're going to go back to Jennifer's PowerPoint, starting with the students who attended the Crandalls from the current slide. Mm-hmm. Students who attended the Crandalls Academy 1833 to 34. Okay, Jennifer, let's
Great,
go.
Wonderful. This is a theme that is so important to our history, but also to the moment we're in right now as a nation. We've all heard the phrase in the last few weeks around the tragic death of George Floyd to say their names, say the names of those who are erased from history. Just 2 years ago in Alabama, a museum opened dedicated to the victims of lynching. And they pointed out that while almost all educated Americans have heard about the lynchings, very few of us can even name one of the victims. And aside from Sarah Harris, who is famous because of the fact that she was the first student to approach Crandall, many of the names of the students are now forgotten. And this was, for me as a researcher, the most exciting part of the story, to consistently look for more clues about who these women are. And so their names are there on your screen. Sarah Harris and her younger sister, Mary Harris. Harriet Rosetta Lanson, a wonderful story from New Haven. Eliza and Miranda Glasgow, a pair of sisters from Griswold who came from an elite Black family. Amy Fenner, who has a grandson and then a great-grandson who take on a different form of racism that is against Hitler and against exclusion in sports. Jerusha Congdon from a female-led family in the greater Canterbury area. Julia and Virginia Tucker, a pair of sisters who came from a poor Black background, were probably in Canterbury. And Julia Williams, who we don't even know exactly where she came from, but she has links to both South Carolina and Boston, and she actually is one of the most famous of the graduates. Anna Liza Hammond and Sarah Hammond, the daughters of that innkeeper I mentioned last time, Elizabeth Hammond. They came from Providence. Elizabeth Smith became a leader in educational integration in Providence after she attended the school and was also one of the finest piano teachers in Providence. Her own son was one of the first Blacks to attend an interracial high school in Providence. So she continued Crandall's legacy in a distinct way. We know almost nothing about Mariah Robinson. She appears in one of the court documents, but then Mary Elizabeth Miles is another one of the very famous graduates. She goes on to marry an escaped slave, Henry Bibb, and together she and her husband, Henry, co-edit a paper. And Mary Elizabeth Miles is by far the better educated of the two in the couple. And so she did most of the writing. So we have extensive writings from her later in her life. Elizabeth Douglas Bastille from Pennsylvania came from a very notable Black family. And in fact, that family is related to Paul Robeson, the great Black singer from the 1930s and 40s. J.K. Johnson and Elizabeth Henley, we don't yet have information on, although I have a very strong suspicion that J.K. Johnson is related to a famous musician, the first Black band leader, who was actually given an award by Queen Victoria for his excellent playing when his band toured there. In New York City, Henrietta Bolt ends up marrying so well that she can hire Irish servants. So we have here a very successful middle-class Black woman. Theodosia de Grasse, with that famous name now, Theodosia, which has been made famous by the musical Hamilton, also came from an interracial family. Her father was actually from India. Her mother maybe from Europe. They all got classified as Black. And very interesting story from many angles of Theodosia de Grasse. And then Anne Peterson came from a family of educators. I'm going to talk a lot more about G.C. Marshall coming up. And then the other women from New York City, we don't know much about. As you can imagine, Polly Freeman is a pretty common Black last name during the pre-Civil War days. So we haven't tracked her down yet, but we're working on it. But I like to say their names so that they become real. And as a teacher myself, I know whenever you have a class of this size, you've got the serious student. You've got the quiet one who doesn't want to participate but does well on tests. You've got the one who's exuberant in class but can't put the ideas down on paper. You've got the one who is kind of bored and looking out the window but is actually hearing what you're saying. We don't know at that level what their personalities were like. But once you get this many people, you know that they were like that. They were a class. They were a cohort learning together and teaching each other. Some of them came, as I say, from fairly well-to-do Black backgrounds, like Elizabeth Bastille, and others from very poor backgrounds, like the Tucker sisters, or probably like Polly Freeman. And yet they were able to trade their stories and learn about each other.
Okay, I want to go over just a couple of them to hear their stories.
Sure.
But I wanted to ask Joni, where did they stay overnight? I mean, in a community that was not very hospitable to the idea of the Black school. Did the Connecticut residents just come for the day? And where did the out-of-state residents reside while they were going to the school?
That's a great question, Sheila. And the answer to that is primarily on site in the museum, well, now the museum, but in the school itself. The Canterbury residents, such as the Harris sisters and probably the Tucker sisters, were what were called day students back then. So they would go to school like our children mostly do today, where they would go to school and then come home at the end of the day. Whereas the other students, like the Glasgow sisters, and then the students from out of state would be boarding students, essentially. So they would board with Prudence Crandall, and their tuition covers their board and their dormitory space, essentially. We don't know exactly how Prudence had the bedding arrangements set up because as the Black law gets passed, she moves her schoolroom upstairs. So people that just stop by to visit or to give her a difficult time only see essentially a parlor on the first floor. So we don't know exactly how they were sleeping or their living space was arranged, but we do know that they, of course, were boarding on site. And this is about the same amount of students that she had eventually at the end of the school that she had of white students before she closed the school down for white students. She had about 20 to 25 students, and she needed that to pay her bills.
Okay, so that basically she had accommodation for boarding. And they didn't have to find accommodations elsewhere in the community.
Correct.
I see. So I want you each to take one of the people on this list. Jennifer, you won. You mentioned Harriet Rosetta Lanson had an interesting history. I want you each to take just one of these people and flesh them out for us, make them more real. Tell us about them.
Well, Harriet Rosetta Lanson was the daughter of a noted African-American man in New Haven, but someone who had fallen on her father had fallen on hard times and probably had an alcoholism issue. And so that white minister of the Black Church in New Haven, who I mentioned last time, Simeon Jocelyn, adopted Harriet as his ward, essentially. And so he sent her to the school, and she wrote some letters back to him. So we actually do have one or two writings from her pen. She ends up dying tragically rather young. She wasn't even 25 when she passed away. But Jocelyn wrote a beautiful obituary of her in The Liberator, which some people feel is the earliest obituary of a young Black woman ever to be published with that extensive commentary. And he pointed out that she had adopted the peace principles of Prudence Crandall first having been raised as a Quaker, but then also influenced by the peace movement of the time. Crandall had urged her students not to take revenge or to show anger, but to show forgiveness. And more than most of the students, Harriet really embraced that. And Jocelyn said that in the entire time she was at the school and after she came back to New Haven, he never once heard her say anything to condemn anything in anger or anything that condemned the white people of Canterbury. She was hoping that they would come around, which of course they ended up doing by 1837. They already started feeling apologetic about it. But even though her story is short, it is very clear that she was an articulate young woman who could have done a lot of good in the world. But now what we have of her is this beautiful memoir by her adoptive father, and the fact that for her, this combination of learning and pacifism were important to the young woman she became.
Interesting. Great. And so, Joni, can you pick someone out? Do you want to tell us about the Harris sisters, which we also think about as coming from Norwich because there was a Norwich connection there? You want to tell about them?
Yeah, absolutely. I know Sarah Harris does also get a lot of attention. So the person that I had picked, Sheila, actually was Mary Harris, because a lot of people don't know as much about Mary, and she continued the education thread that Prudence established. And Mary goes on after her time in Canterbury to marry Pelham Williams, and he is also a teacher. And they agree together with their children during the Civil War to go down to New Orleans, because they want to help start schools for the newly freed African Americans in the New Orleans area. And this is while the war is still happening. And so they go down to New Orleans and they do just that. After the war, they help establish what was then called Strait University. And Pelham oversees the Department of the Normal School, which was the education division. And Mary is listed as teaching English. And Mary's son, Arthur Pelham, goes on to marry a teacher as well, Sylvanie Williams. And there are schools named after Sylvanie Williams to this day. And even during Mary Harris's time, Sylvanie had started a school that also fell due to mob violence because people were unhappy about African Americans being educated. And she does rebuild the school, and it opens a year after Mary Harris passes away. So Mary was probably involved in helping her, making suggestions and such in building that school. But the fact is that there's the Williams family becomes so integrated into the community and the culture of New Orleans that they're well known down there. And Sylvanie has portraits made of her and schools named after her. She becomes very involved in what was called at the time the Negro Women's Clubs. Women's clubs, essentially, and they're inviting Susan B. Anthony and other speakers down to talk to them and be presenters at their organizational meetings. So you see this whole education thread and importance through Mary Harris's line as well.
Well, it's interesting, and Jennifer says it at the bottom of the slide, but the importance of knowing that some of these women were all interconnected in the abolitionist movement as well as the women's suffrage movement. So these movements and the anti-slavery, they were moving together at the same time in the 1800s. So before we move from this slide, Jennifer, is there anyone else you want to point out? Any other comments on the various women on this list?
I think that there are more that will arise naturally. I just wanted to add that Mary Harris's grandsons become leading musicians in New Orleans, just as things are moving from the New Orleans street music scene into the jazz world. And in fact, two of her grandsons play in the same band as the first drum kit set ever for which the drum set was invented. And then another one of her grandchildren marries Cab Calloway. And I mean, it's just amazing. The stories go on. And fortunately for us and for the museum, the descendants of Mary Harris are in touch with the school on a regular basis, and with the museum, I should say, and have shared their stories most generously, and I'll include them in my own writings later on. So the story just goes on and connects to so many important elements of American culture. It's astonishing. So yeah, okay. I'll drop a few more hints about these students as we go on. But in the meantime, I love putting the list up and having it up for this long in case it jogs somebody's memory somewhere else. One of the problems, and I'm sure that Joni will attest to this, one of the problems with women's history is that women change their names. And so, for instance, Elizabeth Smith on this list, Smith is her married name. And so we don't know what her name was when she was attending the school. And I have not yet been able to find it. And Smith being such a common name doesn't make the task any easier. The Polly Freeman I pointed out, Freeman is a common name, but Polly is a nickname for potentially quite a few first names. You know, and so it is exceedingly difficult because of women's name changes to get all these tied down. But somebody might have heard about their great grandmother Elizabeth, you know, or some great you know, Elizabeth so and so from Providence. So keeping the list up is very helpful.
Great. And Joni, just one more question about this. At the museum, do you have any historical documents that show the class list, show any of the class work, any of the lesson plans, or anything related to actually what went on in the teaching at the school?
It's a great question. And the answer I have to honestly say is no. And part of the reason for that is that Prudence did not keep a class list. She needed to protect her students. So she did not want anybody to be able to acquire the list. Jennifer can speak to the fact that one of the best ways that we can tell who her students were was because they were witnesses in the trials later. And we can get their names from the trial transcripts, which are often where we start to do that research. As far as lessons and what she taught, we essentially just have the advertisement that she puts in the newspaper. And I think there are some lists, there are some lists books that she was ordering from local merchants, essentially. So we can tell maybe what edition of what particular natural philosophy book, for example. But that, there wasn't much more.
So it's interesting that the court documents tell us a lot about the history. Yeah.
Yes, the court documents where it was enemies of these students who were trying to name them in order to have power over them. That's where we find out the names of the students and often their hometowns as well.
Okay.
And there are other ways we've been able to confirm this. For instance, a number of the more famous women on this list, like Julia Williams and Mary Elizabeth Miles, when they passed away, it was written about that they were students in the school. And so by that time, the school had acquired, the historical cast it has today by the time the women die in 1860 or 1870. So,
okay, so we're ready to move on.
We are, yes. We won't take this long anymore, but
okay.
So, and I think I pointed this out last time, that there are some misconceptions about Crandall's students. One is that they were all little girls. And go ahead to push it again because I want the answers to be there. So the average age of the students was actually 15 and a half. In other words, they were teenagers. So they're not girls in the technical sense. They are already, past puberty or in puberty. And that's an important part of the story. Okay, and they weren't learning how to read. Most of them already knew how to read. Most of them had received what we would consider an elementary level education. What they were getting was more, as I said last time, on the level of high school to junior college level education. And then the idea that the school was a failure because it only lasted a year and a half is to use the wrong measure. A school should be judged by its impact, not by its longevity. Many of the students in the school go on to live impactful lives in the African American community, both before the Civil War and, as in the case of Mary Harris, after. Go ahead. And so we have the pictures of Sarah Harris and Mary Harris. I give their married names there as well. And then in the picture on the lower right, that's the sister of Gloria Catherine Marshall, Mary Joseph Marshall. We don't have an actual picture of G.C. Marshall, unfortunately. And Mary Joseph Marshall, her daughter, Maricha Lyons, is an African-American woman who goes on to write about the school and about both Elizabeth Smith and Sarah Harris later on. So again, this how important it was for a family to remember that they had a family member who attended, and to keep the legacy going is, I think, an important corroboration of the importance we place on the school.
Right.
And so in terms of the age, and I put this up here because what this tells us is about both the women participants, both the students and also the activists who were a part of it. So you've got a handful of children who attend. So Mary Harris and Sarah Hammond. Almost all of the younger people who attended, of those who are up to the age of 11, were younger sisters of older students who were there. So this was a very common educational practice at that time. Like, hey, take your little kid sister to school too. Right? You can just see these tired moms saying, take your sister. Then most of the students are teenagers, but also Prudence Crandall's sister, Elmira Crandall, is also teaching at the school. She had much less formal schooling than her older sister had, but enough to get started. And she had quite a personality. She was, I think, a bit more fun-loving, as younger sisters often are, than Prudence was, and a bit feistier at the level of fighting off the village ruffians. And then there was a Windham County Female Anti-Slavery Society started that had a lot of young white women in it. Then you've got these young women, people like Sarah Harris and Julia Williams and Prudence Crandall herself, Mary Burley, who was another teacher in the school, and more of the members of that Windham County Female Anti-Slavery Society. Then when you get up to the older group, older women, there just weren't as many. So what you're seeing here is that this was a movement of young women. And I point that out because, we're all talking now about Black Lives Matter. That was started by two Black women who at the time they started it were in their 20s and 30s, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of energy coming from this youthful category. Okay, go ahead. And then what the white elites of Canterbury did is they passed a law that made it illegal to teach out-of-state Blacks without the permission of the town. They made it, and by the way, they didn't make it illegal to bring in Blacks as workers or Blacks as slaves or Blacks as servants. They just made it illegal to educate Blacks in the state of Connecticut. So Crandall needed a legal team, and some of those wealthy white male abolitionists helped to put together a very good one. William Ellsworth was a very prominent Connecticut politician, and he actually built the arguments for Black citizenship that show up again in Brown v. Board. Calvin Goddard and Henry Strong are two more Norwich connections. They both came from Norwich, and therefore they had some living connections to the Black community in Norwich. And they likewise made some strong arguments for Black citizenship. And the arguments of Ellsworth, Goddard, and Strong helped to convince someone by the name of William Jay. William Jay was only the son of John Jay, one of the founding Supreme Court justices.
Right, right.
Yeah, exactly. And William Jay, through this kind of being brought in through the Crandall case, he ends up giving his legal talents to abolitionism through the crucial decades of the 1830s and 1840s.
Interesting.
Isn't
Okay,
it
so
true?
yeah. So they created, the Connecticut legislature created a law just for Prudence Crandall
That's
to
right.
make it illegal to bring out-of-state students to a school.
Right.
And because of her connections with the Liberator, with the abolitionists, even with the women's movement, she was able to bring together excellent legal team to help her make the legal arguments were wonderful, but she was stuck with the establishment of Canterbury and the Connecticut legislature, which wasn't good. Let me ask Joni, when we get into these legal issues, I know a very successful thing in some of the historical museums, like down in Williamsburg. They do recreations of courtroom motions and courtroom things, and they allow the various guests at the museum to partake in some kind of a legal question, some kind of a vote or a jury. Do you have anything like that at the Prudence Crandall, or would you like to institute something like that? I think it would be a lot of fun.
No, honestly, the trend in museums now is to step away from that because it is difficult history, and it's challenging to expect students to try and process that. So we go with what the teachers would prefer as far as how we introduce them to difficult history. And I understand that there have been some teachers that have done that in the past, and I only know that because I'm going through a lot of old files right now. But the trend is to move away from simulation, essentially, but certainly discussing these court cases and the importance of the arguments that we're putting forward, because we are the first systemic citizenship case for African Americans in the United States, is certainly something that we talk about, or certainly we'll be talking about in more detail.
Well, I think that's a shame because, someone who went to law school, you had to stand up, you had to recite, you had to be articulate, you had to formulate your reasons and your logic and get your point across. I think that's something that's missing in our schools today. We don't have enough elocution. We don't have enough lessons for kids to learn how to speak, how to articulate, how to come up with seasoned and reasoned arguments. I think that it's a wonderful thing to have some kind of a recreation or simulation. But again, I guess I'm old fashioned. I just don't think our students today speak well, articulate, have great vocabularies. Do you agree with me, Jennifer, on that issue?
When it comes to what museums do in particular, I understand how thorny any kind of recreation can be. But I certainly agree with you that there are problems in elocution among modern day college students on how to craft an argument. And in general, the potential effects of rhetoric have been watered down. And I don't think we could have seen a president, or for that matter, other public officials who speak as poorly as they do just 20 years ago or 40 years ago. I think that that would have been considered laughable. Of course, I still consider it laughable, but that's another story for another time. One thing I would say is that there are 4 trials that happen around the Crandall School, 3 of them involving that Black law. The first one would actually make for a fairly good movie, but it would be extraordinarily hard to recreate. And that's because there was a gamesmanship that William Ellsworth brought to the table, where he was trying to get the women students to not speak, while Andrew Judson, the man who is currently on the screen, was trying to incriminate them, as well as their teacher, as well as the whole enterprise in which they were involved. So you kind of have to understand the backstory, but also understand the social positioning of those women. And those are the complexities that I think Joni is referring to when she says it's hard to recreate these things.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you have the jury out for a fairly long time before they come back hopelessly deadlocked. The second trial is all about the ego of one man, David Daggett, who is anti-Black and who is against Crandall's enterprise. And he just rides his ego to his own solution. The third trial involving the Black Law was a bunch of, well, it was 4 white lawyers, 3 of whom wanted to overturn Daggett's decision, and Daggett himself, who should have recused himself since it was his own decision. But the other 3 knew Daggett was wrong, but he was retiring soon and they really respected him, so they chose not to go against him. So you have 3 white men sacrificing the citizenship rights of, 20% of the American population at that time because they didn't want to bother one white guy's ego. Yeah. And I'm not sure that makes for good TV. It certainly makes for very good, scathing philosophic critique in my writings, but it doesn't necessarily make for good TV.
If they get the overall picture in a way that, I think the overall picture is not hard to understand. We don't have to get into the weeds of the technology and the technical aspects and that are part of this decision. After all, it was on a technical matter that the whole thing fell apart, really, right? Right,
exactly. The Supreme Court of Connecticut punted, as I like to say.
Exactly.
Sports analogy. We may never have sports again, so sports analogy may disappear soon. But
courts do that. Courts do that a lot. If they can find a way not to make a decision, that's what they prefer. Yeah. So on the screen now are our values and views that
no, we have Andrew Judson up there. That it's very important to remember. It's very important to remember that almost 100% of Crandall's opposition was white people. It is so easy for this story to become one about white heroism, and doing that erases the fact that the vast majority of the white people were against the school and against Black education. This man, Andrew Judson, was the ringleader, and he lived right kitty corner across the street from the school.
Right.
And he made it quite clear that Black people were not to be given full citizenship and were not really a part of the United States. So as he said here, the colored people can never rise from their menial condition in our country. They ought not to be permitted to rise here. Right. They're an inferior race of beings and never can or ought to be recognized as the equals of whites. And you can see here again, Sheila, I can point to your legal background, that he's using what I call a diseased logic. He says they can never rise, they ought not to be permitted to rise. So if they shouldn't be permitted to rise, it means they can rise, which makes his first internally false, right? So he is both saying that Blacks are not human and saying, and I don't want any evidence that they are human to appear.
Exactly. But that view that you have on the screen was a prevalent view of most Americans back in the 1800s before the Civil War. I mean, even Abraham Lincoln, in one of his debates with Douglas, talked about the inferiority of the Black race. He was sympathetic to the idea that slavery was an affliction and was an abomination, but he had no problem in talking about Blacks as inferior in many ways. So maybe he meant it inferior socially and not genetically in a way, but he still said it. And many others said it as well.
It was absolutely common. What makes Andrew Judson the best representative of this is that he was outspoken on this issue. It wasn't just an accidental doctrine for him. It wasn't one that was simply conceding to white public opinion. It was deeply felt. And he wrote a few years after the Crandall affair, he said, "I don't regret anything I said or did."
Wow. So, and there are still people in America today who would sanction his saying it and would agree with him.
Exactly. So the 4 trials that I mentioned, this is a drawing from an early edition of a children's novel about the Crandall story that shows Prudence Crandall sitting there alone. She doesn't get to speak at the trial. at any point. We have no record of her speaking either in her defense or being brought as a witness by the prosecution. And so if you go to the next slide,
or by the defense. I mean, in a
Right.
case where you have an articulate and bright woman who needs to be defended, the defense counsel might think that she should testify and speak for herself. But because of, I guess, the culture and the way it was done,
Yeah.
she did not appear as a witness in her own trial.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
instead, I've corrected the picture. And some of these are some pictures I showed earlier, and some are of early 19th century photos of Black women. But the students did have to testify. And they were in this perilous situation where they were in risk of their own prosecution later. They were already being persecuted. And remember, they're teenagers. What is the age group that is least likely to be able to control their public emotions in a trial, or maybe roll their eyes or whatever? But no, these students showed remarkable discipline throughout. They were intelligent, they were savvy. In each of the 3 trials where they spoke, we know that they did nothing but speak well and speak clearly for their school and for their education, and for both women and African Americans. Go ahead. There was also a lot of vigilante violence against the school. And I refer to this as the 2-pronged approach. And I think we still see it in America today. On the one hand, there were legal restrictions on Black citizenship, on Black ownership of property and so on. But while all of this legal persecution was going on, there was a constant threat to Black safety going on from the general white populace. So this vigilante violence included the refusal of drinking water to the school. At one point, the well at the school was polluted with cow dung. Eggs and rocks were thrown at the school. I mentioned earlier about Elmira Crandall, Prudence's sister, who took one of the rocks that went through the front window and put it on the mantle as a trophy, right? So, and whenever any of the students appeared in public, there were taunts and jeers and noisemakers and so on. And so this was a constant level of vigilante violence. Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to ask Joni, what evidence of the trial or some of this vigilante violence do you talk about at the museum?
All of it, essentially, with the exception of the part where they killed the cat and put the cat on the fence threateningly, because that deals with animal violence. And so we don't mention that as often, but all of these other things we do mention. Often we have visitors ask us what was a normal day for these students. And, if you want to learn about life, ordinary days in the 1830s, I recommend people go to Sturbridge Village, because for our students, every single day was a not typical day for them, because it might start typical. Prudence would start each school day with a prayer, and then they would sit down to their lessons. But the moment that egg hits the door, or that rock comes through the window, or somebody is, delivering a threatening letter on the door that Prudence has to deal with and respond to, it's no longer a normal day. And so what we talk about more is how the students, responded to that. And it's what Jennifer mentioned, through the peacefulness. Their own writings tell us that they found the place to be, the school, a very peaceful place to be, that they consider themselves very comfortable and safe there, which was unusual. It was a refuge against all of what the violence that they were dealing with. And when the archaeology was done in the 1970s, I've been reading those reports. One of the things that I found particularly powerful is that the archaeologists, while they mention, yes, it is often normal to find, broken glass shards, they found an unusual amount of broken glass shards in their dig around the perimeters of our school, which speaks to not only the repetitive violence, but also the night that the mob attacked on September 9th of 1834. And I would love to be able to borrow some of those items, which are housed at the University of Connecticut, and have them on display when we reopen, because I I don't think there's anything more meaningful than seeing the results of that violence and how it helps speak to the experiences that the students were enduring. It's so much more important than simply talking about what dresses they wore, what food they ate, what books they read, which is important in its own right. But our site is unique for a specific reason, and it's because of the violence that happened.
Well, what are the artifacts that are at the museum that you would like?
What artifacts are at the museum? Not much.
You said you would like to go to the Connecticut Museum and get the artifacts.
Oh, the glass shards from the archaeological dig.
Okay.
Yes.
Mhm.
It was.
And where did you get this story, Jennifer, about Elmira displaying the rock? Is that the authentic rock from the actual?
No, that's not the authentic rock.
That
That is just a rock.
Of course, but where did that story come from?
Oh, she wrote about it in a letter.
Okay,
To Garrison.
important to know. All right. And is that letter at the museum?
No, letters written to William Lloyd Garrison are preserved in the Boston Public Library, and they are accessible online. They were digitized some time ago because William Lloyd Garrison is such a prominent historical figure. So you can read everything from Prudence's very first letter to him through all the abolitionist years and past, even to the ones that she wrote to his family later after he
Oh, okay. And do you keep copies of those at the museum, or you refer people to that other museum?
Both, yes, they can see it at the museum, copies, but if they really want to see the original, like scholars of the caliber of Jennifer, that's what they.
Yeah, I've looked at the ones in Boston, but they are very defensive of those. And yeah, I love this quote. This was written by a student in 1833, and she says, "The Canterburyans, meaning the white Canterburyans, are savage. They will not sell Miss Crandall an article at their shops. My ride from Hartford to Brooklyn was very unpleasant, being made up of blackguards. I came on foot from here to Brooklyn. But the happiness I enjoy here pays me for all. The place is delightful. All that is wanting to complete the place is civilized men." So last evening, the news reached us that the new law, meaning the black law, had passed.
Right.
The bell rang and a cannon was fired for half an hour. Where is justice? In the midst of all this, Miss Crandall is unmoved. When we walk out, horns are blown and pistols fired.
Was there any serious violence? We know yes to the property, but what about to life? Were any of the students physically harmed?
None of them were, to our knowledge. There is one hint in the writings of Julia Foote that there was a student who suffered a mental health crisis as a result. She said she knew one student who had to leave the school and was never herself after that. I'm suspicious that might be Ann Peterson, but we haven't been able to connect the dots on that with historical certainty. But the idea that this would have had an impact on the mental and emotional life of the students is obvious. The other thing is that when the school was closing down in the late summer of 1834, there had been a series of riots against the free Black community in New York City and Philadelphia that had included violence and loss of life, and also rape and threats of rape against Black women. And obviously, because of the age of these students, the idea of what we now call sexual violence and sexual intimidation was undoubtedly present throughout the entire crisis. I think we'd know if things had crossed that line because of the press coverage that the school received as it was in existence. There would have at least been some mention of outrages, and there isn't. So I think we can be grateful that it didn't go that far, but I think that's part of why Crandall closed the school when she did, that the attack on that night of September 9th was so vicious that the threat of physical harm was no longer one you could laugh off.
Well, it was a program of intimidation, and in the end result, it worked, didn't it? Sadly.
This is, of course, the one instance of an actual death, which is that a black and white cat was butchered and placed over the fence as a warning. And one night when I was writing that section, my late mother-in-law's black and white cat came and sat next to me, which he rarely did. He was a rescued feral cat, but I think he knew I was writing about his distant ancestor. So
interesting.
Yeah.
And that's the story, Joni, you don't want to tell the students who come to the museum. You leave that story out.
No, we do tend to, particularly with children, to be honest.
Sure.
It really depends on their level of interest.
Of course.
I think
Yeah.
something in Canterbury will have to kind of come to terms with that. I think in the way that the Tennessee town that killed the elephant did, and I think it's fabulous. They now have become an elephant supporting location in Tennessee, and it was on NPR. I heard about it, and I thought, wow, that would be amazing if we could do something similar. But really, the story about the students is much more important.
Right.
I mean, I think that this is one of those things that the killing of the cat shows something about that. There's a cline or a continuum from violence against animals to violence against people, and I think that's been shown psychologically.
In my work in domestic violence, it's very, very clear that violence against young people, against women, is a clear line from violence against pets. Very much so.
Yeah.
All right. Student response.
This one was another student essay about nonviolence. So this is coming from one of those Black young women, and she says, "We as a body, my dear schoolmates, are subject to many trials and struggles, and we all know to what they are attributable. It is the prejudice of the whites have against us that causes us to labor under so many disadvantages. They are so prejudiced against us that they will not suffer us to come up and be sharers in any of their privileges. Oh, prejudice, prejudice, heaven grant thy reign may be short. My friends, although the white people may be so enraged against us as to try to break down every benevolent effort that is made in our behalf and put every obstacle they can in our way to prevent our progress, you are aware that ever since we have been under Miss Crandall's instruction, it has been her utmost care to persuade us not to indulge in angry feelings towards our enemies. With unceasing and untiring earnestness has she pled with us to forgive them, and now let us try to abide by her counsel and feel at peace with all men." And this letter to me is very meaningful because you can sense in it the internal struggle that the students are having between their anger, their frustration, their rage, and the example of their teacher and some of the others around them who are saying, no, we're going to do this nonviolently. And we know from the 20th century and Dr. King's movement that nonviolence is not easy, and that to maintain nonviolence, you have to be angry enough to be on the point of rage, but then not use that rage, take that rage somewhere else.
Yeah.
And here we see these students doing it. It's almost as if they're having a predictive dream of what Dr. King would be able to accomplish in that century.
They put themselves kind of in a zone, a special zone of nonviolence.
I like that, Sheila.
Not reacting. Yeah, I feel like almost a not a mystical thing, but just a psychological bubble that they put themselves in to withstand it and to move on. I think it's a beautiful letter.
Yeah,
it really is. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Joni, why don't you talk about this? Colored schools broken up in the Free States.
Yes, one of the things that we do want to emphasize when we open the museum again is that the North was not a safe place for these students. Jennifer referred to the race riots that were occurring in New York. There were also ones in Philadelphia. And this is also during the time where a lot of African Americans who are free are being captured and brought into the South and enslaved. And so, our students that are traveling by themselves to come to this school and be here, they're extremely courageous and brave. They're putting their lives on the line. And some of the students, one in particular, Julia Williams, goes on to attend the school at the Noyes Academy in Canaan, New Hampshire. And that school also ends up being destroyed due to mob violence as well. And as late as in the early 1900s, where I mentioned Sylvanie Williams' school, Mary Harris's daughter-in-law in New Orleans, you're still seeing schools being destroyed by angry white mobs. So this was something pretty significant that these students had to endure.
Right. And so it wasn't just the school in Canterbury. They had these experiences in other places around the country. That's important to know. Yeah. And
when the school closed, Samuel Joseph May, one of Crandall's strongest, most stalwart allies, said this, which I think is so important in our day when we're seeing this resurgence of interest in racial justice. He said, "I felt ashamed of Canterbury, ashamed of Connecticut, ashamed of my country, ashamed of my color. thus ended the generous, disinterested, philanthropic Christian enterprise of Prudence Crandall. But he admits it. He's like, yes, I still live here. Yes, I'm still a citizen of Connecticut in the United States. And yes, I'm white, but I'm ashamed of what we've done.
Yeah.
And being able to acknowledge that is, I think, part of what it means to genuinely be an adult. I also think it's part of what it means to genuinely be part of a collectivity, whether it's your city or your state or your country or your race. You know, you have to acknowledge when you've done good things and when you haven't. And so I think that was a very strong comment on his part.
Absolutely, because that was 1834. We still have another 25 plus years to go before the Civil War and
Right.
Lincoln in 1860. So things are boiling up, I guess, over the next decades.
So, as I said, Canterbury is not a failure, nor was it just a publicity stunt. Go ahead. And I've given here a diagram that shows some of the impact and how people went on to other areas, these students. And I mentioned many of them on the student slide. But Theodosia de Grasse marries a man named Peter Vogelsang, who becomes the oldest member of the Massachusetts 54th, which was the first African-American regiment in the Civil War.
Oh, wow. Isn't that the movie? They did a movie of that.
Yes, Glory. The
Yeah.
best war movie ever. Maybe the only war movie I actually like.
Beautiful. Yeah. It was great. I think he won an Academy Award for that performance, actually.
Yeah.
It was great.
That's a wonderful movie.
I just want to follow up that Prudence's grandson, not direct descendant, but step-grandson, was in the 55th, was a officer in the 55th with one of William Lloyd Garrison's sons. And that was also an all-African-American unit as well.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. And that in terms of the reach of the alumna from the Academy, went all over the United States, as you can see, the Louisiana connection being one that Joni had pulled out. And internationally, the students are active. Mary Elizabeth Miles moving up to Ontario with her husband, Henry Bibb. Julia Williams spends some time educating Black women in Jamaica, also travels to London. There's connections to Cuba. We know that Annalisa Hammond travels there, as well as to Liberia, where the Tucker sisters end up. So all over the world, the influence of Crandall's students continues.
Okay. And just to go back to the legal stuff, it was a technicality. Something about not asking proper permission to open the school, right? They needed to be able to plead that, and there wasn't that being pled properly. And so it was deadlocked, and all of the different legal actions created lots of important people coming and giving great statements and beautiful expressions of philosophy and anti-racism. But in the end, it was the violence and the fear and intimidation that she would hurt her students that made her close the school, not the legal thing, right?
Well, one of the points I made about the two-pronged strategy, that there was a legal strategy and then an extra legal strategy, the vigilante violence, is that when the legal strategy had essentially dead-ended with that Supreme Court non-decision, both sides were looking at, oh no, we're going to have to restart that whole legal engine. And so at that point, I think what happened was that even the Canterbury elite whites decided we can't afford to go through 3 more trials. That's crazy. Let's just tear the place down. Because it was not even a full month after that Supreme Court non-decision that the final murderous attack happened. Then that next school, Canaan in New Hampshire, that was also torn from its foundations, quite literally, by mob violence, they never even tried to make that illegal. It was vigilante from the start.
Yeah.
So there was an abandonment of the legal strategy because it hadn't worked. So these were some of the men involved in the lives of the students. Peter Vogelsang there, you can see him in his Civil War uniform. Henry Bibb, the escaped slave who married Mary Elizabeth Miles. Henry Highland Garnett, very famous Black abolitionist writer, considered really the 19th century equivalent of Malcolm X, by any means necessary kind of guy. And George Downing, who was a particular favorite of Crandall. She had his picture in her Hall of Fame at her own house. He helped to integrate the schools of Rhode Island.
Right.
And then, while Crandall was still alive, in 1885 in Chicago, in Illinois, a group of elite African Americans, led by a lawyer by the name with last name Williams, he started a Prudence Crandall Literary Club with his wife, Fanny Barrier Williams, who had been born free in upstate New York. And this became really this literary club, but also really the place for upper middle class Blacks in Chicago. And they kept Crandall's name alive, and they wrote to her, and she wrote back.
Well, that's interesting. So she made a splash around the country. I mean, what happened in Canterbury was there were ripples of it felt around the country, and this group thought highly enough of her to create this society in her name.
Exactly.
Right?
And what this shows is that the people who she was bound to benefit, who were the middle class educated Blacks in the 1830s, that group always remembered her and kept her memory alive when white people were either sentimentalizing her or forgetting her.
Wow.
And I have been able to uncover numerous references to her in the Black press in the 1880s and 1890s, right after her death, and even into the 19-teens and 1920s. So
wow.
The African American elite certainly recognized what she had done, and that it took a lot to do what she had done.
Right.
Yeah.
So this Fanny Barrier Williams had a very illustrious career herself, and worked with Booker T. Washington and so on. Right.
Yep. And then this fellow also, you can skip him, actually. We'll look at him some other time. But yeah, that she actually wrote an essay on her. And then Mark Twain came to her aid to help her in the state of Connecticut give her a lifelong pension.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Joni, after the school was shut down, she didn't stay in Connecticut. She moved out to the Midwest. Why did she move out to the Midwest, and what did she do there?
Oh, wow, it's actually a complicated question. Essentially, some of it had to do with her marriage. She had married right before the school was attacked on September 9th. She'd married about a month before, August 12th. And she'd married a Baptist minister, Calvin Filio. It was not a successful marriage. And her father had purchased property out in Illinois. His intent was to move his family out there because he was very dissatisfied with the treatment of Prudence in Canterbury. So when Prudence has an opportunity to go out to her deceased father's farm and kind of make it successful, she uses that as an opportunity to leave her husband. And she and her nephew, Hezekiah's son, do go out to Illinois. And she spends the largest part of her life actually out in Illinois. And there she does get involved. She stays involved with abolition. She stays involved with education. She gets involved in the suffrage movement and also the temperance movement as well.
Okay, and Jennifer, tell us, Mark Twain, back in Connecticut, he wants to do something special for her. So the Connecticut legislature does. What do?
They end up giving her a pension to apologize for her wrongful address. And that pension does enable her in the last chapter of her life in Kansas to not be in poverty and to be able to pursue her interests in spiritualism and women's rights, but also in African American rights. One of the things that has been uncovered recently was the fact that she was in touch with a man who was at the bottom of the screen, Andrew Atchison, who was the white founder of a Kansas school for Blacks. And he has his students write her letters and she responds to that. And the last letter that we have found from Prudence Crandall herself was addressed to the children of William Lloyd Garrison. And in there, she states that she reads a Black newspaper from Kansas at least once a week to make sure that she understands what African Americans are doing themselves instead of just hearing about them. So she remained active in Black education and Black thought right up to the moment of her own passing in January of 1890.
Okay. So it's interesting. Her story continues after the Civil War and into the 20th century, where Connecticut names her a heroine. Joni, how does that come about?
It's my understanding that our junior docent program, which was running for some time, worked on that with writing letters to the state legislature. And in 1995, they were able to successfully, because we had Nathan Hale as a hero, so they felt that Connecticut needed a heroine, a state heroine officially as well, and so they decided Prudence Crandall should be that person. And it was through their Pennies for Prudence initiative that raised funds for the statue that is now.
Wow, fantastic.
And while we're speaking about the statue, I want to go back to something that Joni said at the very beginning. She mentioned how it was 1969 when the state bought the property that is now the museum and that had been the school. And we're in this era where we as a nation are reevaluating the monuments around the country. But we were in a mood like that too in 1969. It was the fact that we were in the middle of a civil rights movement that made the purchase of this house that had been such a key place in abolitionist history more necessary. And so, and this is the kind of monument I do want to see preserved and that I want to see live on for centuries.
Sure.
And so, I've put here another kind of just circle of influence of the people we've mentioned over our two shows with you, Sheila. And this is just a remarkable ripple from that one little drop of Mariah Davis bringing The Liberator into Crandall reading it, and then Sarah Harris saying, "Can I be admitted?" and Crandall's mind having changed and said yes.
Wow.
Right? And so from that, we get all these other things we've been able to talk about. And I think that this should go to show us that those little individual actions that we do, they do have an impact. This is just one that made the news enough that we can trace it. And yet it's also sometimes wispy. It just escapes us because they're women or African American, but it's there. And the more that we look, the more we find. And that is just a sign that we can live in a better country, and that people like Crandall and her students knew that, and they put their efforts to making it happen.
Right. Okay. And I love this. He persisted. You created that after the Elizabeth Warren thing in the Senate, right?
Yes. Yeah. You've tagged my reference correctly, Sheila. Yes.
Oh wow! I told you I'm a news junkie. I'm a C-SPAN junkie. So I actually watched her on the floor. She was trying to read Scott King, Mrs. Martin Luther Jr. King, read a letter that she wrote against the guy who was trying to come back in the United States Senate, Sessions. He was going to be nominated for Attorney General, and Elizabeth Warren said, "See what Loretta Scott King says about him. She thinks he's a racist. She thinks he's awful. I want to read this letter." And Senator McConnell from Kentucky, the head of the Senate for the Republicans, wouldn't let her. He said, "You can't do that. You're saying words that are improper against one of our own senators," because Sessions was had been a senator. And she persisted. She kept trying to say, "But wait a minute, this is a letter from Mrs. King. I need to read it. It's about how racist Mr. Sessions has been over the years in his career." And he wouldn't let her. But nevertheless, she kept going. She persisted. But sadly, she had to sit down finally. She did sit down.
It was McConnell who, in explanation, tried to explain why he had shushed her and said she was warned, she was given an explanation, and nevertheless she persisted.
He actually said those words. Yeah. That's true. But she did sit down. She did finally sit down. But anyway, I'm going to come back to the three of us. Do this, come back and stop this sharing of the thing. This is wonderful. It shows the importance of learning our history, which so many young people today are bereft of. Old people too don't know our history, especially the history of the important women. I was hoping that in this year of the 100th anniversary of getting the right to vote, that we would have more programs like this officially on TV, in our museums. And of course, the pandemic has shut a lot of that down, sadly. And so this is an important way that you're helping us to keep alive the memory of people like Prudence Crandall, who persisted, although, the violence and the culture of the time made her shut down too, right? She couldn't do it.
She wasn't able to do it. And in my analysis of that moment of the closure of the school, it really is a number of different factors coming together at once. But certainly her marriage was a part of it. And the fact that a lot of the white men who had been her allies before were more cowardly now because of what had happened, or were simply, they just didn't think women were important enough for the movement to be riding on this one school. So you get the intersectionality again, where race and gender and age, it all comes together. And then the particularly corrosive things that could happen in a bad marriage in the 19th century really took away from Crandall's agency at that crucial moment.
And of course, we always talk about leading up to the Civil War, we concentrate on the slavery in the South, but the way the free blacks lived in the North is very important too. How there was tremendous prejudice and racism against them as well, and how despite that, so many of them rose above it, like the Harris people and all the others you talked about, through getting educated and becoming teachers and becoming involved in the movement. So it's important to know that. I think we overlook that when we're studying the Civil War. We overlook what's going on with the black population in the North and the free states. So I want each of you now to give a summary. Why is it important to learn about Prudence Crandall? What messages and lessons does it have for today in America, in our quite imperfect union at this point, and how we need to try to make it better? Jennifer, you start, and then we'll do Joni.
I think that the story of Prudence Crandall tells us a lot that we need right now. For white people, it says that we do have an anti-racist legacy that we can look to and draw from. And I think it also speaks to the power of education and the power of nonviolence. That these were important early steps and movements that we've seen develop since. As I said before, I think we also see what can be started from that one ripple in the pool. One person just trying to influence or address another and just awaken each other so that, well, we can be woke, but awaken each other to the truth of what's happening is, I think, an important lesson here. And also the fact that you were just pointing to, Sheila, this ongoing resilience, resistance to oppression, and continued emphasis on thought that we see from African Americans in this Crandall episode, and even into how they follow her later into the late 19th and early 20th century, teaches us something about the African American dimension of American history. Thanks for having me.
Okay, excellent. Joni, your final thoughts?
Oh my goodness, I don't know how to top that. Jennifer said that so wonderfully and eloquently, but I just want to add that we are the place where this occurred. And so please come see us, visit the museum, use us as a place of inspiration, because, these students in Prudence, they were extremely courageous. History is very relevant today. I think young people more and more are starting to find that out. And we're bringing out the history that has been ignored in the past more into the present and into focus. And that should allow us to, as Jennifer says, create a better America.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been a wonderful meeting both of you and having you give us the history and the lessons for today. I appreciate it so much and love to have you back on any topic, because you're both so educated and important in our culture and in our educational system. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Joni. See you next time. See everybody next time on Talk Back. Bye. Bye.